Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we're going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of those games in the book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. Now we're going to continue looking at the games of Efim Bogoljubov. This is the final game of Bogoljubov's we're going to see in this series. In this game Bogoljubov has the black pieces and his opponent, Paul F. Jonner, has the white pieces. Now the game starts off with d4, knight f6, c4, c6, knight f3, d5, we have e3, e6, bishop to d3. So we've got into basically almost like a Slav defense, or a semi-Slav defense with knight d7 likely coming next. Now here Reti comments that white played bishop to d3 because he hasn't developed this knight yet. Usually you might play knight f3 and knight c3 first, but here white has played bishop to d3 first because he wants to reserve the chance of playing this knight to either c3 or to d2 depending on the position. Now black could also potentially try to develop to even something like knight e4, trying to get a stone wall here. In which instance white's bishop may even be better placed on e2 according to Reti. But black continues normally with knight b to d7. We have castles, bishop e7. And now Reti comments that white's main chance at getting attacking chances now rests on trying to play knight to c3 and trying to push e4. This should be white's main goal, just to try and get some more attacking chances. And this is why Bogoljubov played his bishop to e7 rather than to d6. So obviously the bishop was on d6 and white pushes e4. Black's got to respond because e5 is going to be a fork. Now here we see knight to c3, castles, and e4. So white achieves the plan which Reti was talking about. We have d takes e4, knight takes e4, b6, queen to e2, bishop to b7, and now rook to d1. Now this rook to d1 move, Reti comments that we would usually expect white to develop the c8 bishop here. But in this instance we don't. And the reason is Reti comments that white isn't really too sure where he wants this bishop. There's quite a few good squares for it. You know, it could go to f4, it could go to g5, you could play b2 and play bishop, so you could play b3 and then bishop b2. There's quite a lot of squares for it, so white doesn't commit the bishop to any of these squares at this point. Now Reti argues that he thinks b3 followed by bishop to b2 would be most aligned with the position, because black wants to push c5. Black wants to try and free up his position, free up his bishop, and he's going to do that by breaking in the center with c5. And after c5 by black comes, having a bishop on this diagonal is very useful because this diagonal is going to open quite quickly. And Reti contrasts this this hesitation almost with Bogoljubov. He throughout this chapter, he's spoken quite a lot about how Bogoljubov is very confident in his moves, how he's very optimistic. He's very sure of himself. And Bogoljubov wouldn't have hesitated in terms of knowing where to develop his bishop. He would have seen what plan he wants and he would have played it immediately. Now here Bogoljubov responds with queen c7, and now we see bishop to g5. We have rook f to e8, and our knight takes f6 jack. And the idea of this is white wants to try and bring his knight to e5. However, Reti argues that white should really see that c5 is intended, and so should try and simplify the position down more. Should try and simplify the position down, and therefore he doesn't really like this move. Now here we have knight takes f6 and knight to e5. c5 is played, d takes c5, and b takes c5. And here we sort of see the reason for white simplifying down and trying to play knight to e5, because it looks as if black's position is worse, because he's got this seemingly bad pawn structure. And it's worth noting the reason why white thought that this maneuver of taking an f6 and playing knight to e5 worked is because black cannot take on c5 with a queen. Because of bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and then bishop takes h7 check. A nice little sacrifice. Queen h5, king g8, and then queen takes f7 check. You should at the very least pick up the bishop, but it's likely going to be mate. So white, in playing this knight takes f6, followed by knight to e5 maneuver, thought that black would be unable to free himself with c5 without ending up with a far worse pawn structure. However, Bogoljubov wasn't really deterred by this. Bogoljubov had no issue going into this position with this pawn structure. And Reti comments that if you look at the pawn structure, it may seem as if black's position is worse, but realistically, he argues that black is better. And the reason is he says that white's queenside pawn majority is less important than black's central pawn majority, because white will never really be able to advance these pawns to create a passed pawn, which essentially gives Bogoljubov an extra pawn in the center, which he is able to mobilize, unlike white's extra pawn on the queen side. Now here we have f4, trying to keep control of the e5 square. Rook a to d8. We have bishop to c2, rook takes d1 check, rook takes d1, rook to d8, rook takes d8, queen takes d8. So we have all of the rooks coming off the board. Queen to d3, offering another trade, and threatening potential mating ideas after taking and queen takes h7 check. And now we see queen to a5. And this is quite a nice little move. So black is here threatening the a2 pawn, and is also threatening a move like bishop to e4. And because of this, white almost has to give up their bishop pair. So white has to sort of try and go through with this combination of taking on f6 in order to try and get the queen takes f7 check. Well, it'll be queen takes f7 mate, because after king f8, queen h8 will be mate. So we see queen e1 check, stopping the mate. Bogoljubov obviously saw the obvious mate threat. So queen to e1 check, queen f1, queen takes f1, king takes f1, and now bishop takes f6. And now we sort of see the beauty of the queen a5 move, in that it almost forced white to give up the bishop pair. Because of the threats of bishop e4 and the threat on queen takes a2, white had no choice but to give up this bishop. White had no choice but to give up the bishop pair. And now we see g3 and h6. And here Reti takes a moment to pause. He says that this endgame isn't really a typical example in terms of the power of the bishop pair. The bishop pair do come to life later on. However, Black's plan isn't really to try and open up all the lines and Black isn't trying to restrict the knight and the bishop. If Black was playing in terms of the bishop pair versus the knight and bishop, then Black may have even considered something like g takes f6 here to limit this knight's movement. So instead of this, Bogoljubov sees that Black's main advantage is the extra pawn in the center. And White's pawn is still not really able to advance that quickly. It's going to take quite a few moves before White can try and utilize his queenside majority, especially with a move like a5 clamping down on this potential square. So therefore, Bogoljubov, instead of trying to utilize the advantage of the bishop pair, this is a great example of how he uses his advantage in terms of the central pawn majority, and he gets this his kingside pawn majority rolling really quite nicely. You see king e2, centralizing the king, g5, king to e3, g takes f4 check, g takes f4, and bishop to g7. And now we see b3. Now, Reti comments that something like bishop e4 may look quite obvious, essentially trying to get the bishop pair. Trying to remove almost like Black's main advantage of having the bishop pair. But here, after f5 check, king to d3, bishop takes e5, f takes e5, Black's extra central pawn should be enough to secure the win. White just hasn't got the moves to try and create fast pawns here. Meanwhile, Black's king could easily be able to get up and escort this pawn up to the first rank and queen. Or, alternatively, Black could almost use this pawn as a decoy to decoy the white king away, giving Black enough chance to start gobbling up some extra pawns. So we don't see bishop to e4. Instead, we see b3. And now f5. And this, Reti comments, is Bogoljubov essentially starting the key maneuver. So at this point, Bogoljubov had almost a basic plan. He wanted to lock this pawn in place with f5. He wanted to move this bishop to d6. Wanted to move this king to f6, which would force this knight to move because there'd be the king and the bishop attacking. Obviously, this king can't get any closer because of everything being covered. So after the knight moves, he can then force through the move e5. That's how Bogoljubov plans in this position to convert his pawn majority in the center. Bishop on d6, pawn on f5, king on f6, force this knight to move, and then push e5. And we see him start to do that with f5 straight away, fixing this pawn here, and also removing the weakness, so this king is free to move. We then see a3 and a5. So Bogoljubov has to stop White from being able to exploit his own queenside majority. And here, b4 would just be met with a series of captures, and Black would be winning again. We see bishop to d3. And White can only really wait here. White can play bishop to d3 and bishop to c2, and that's about it. For instance, if White was to play something like bishop to d1, then bishop to e4 could come, and this would just cripple White. You know, this bishop, it suddenly got no scope. So instead, we see bishop to d3, bishop to f6, bishop to c2, king to g7, bishop to d3, bishop to d8, bishop to c2, and this bishop is going backwards and forwards, whilst Black is casually maneuvering all of his pieces into their ideal position. And now Bogoljubov has achieved almost the first stage of his plan. He's got his king to f6, he's got his bishop on d6 and he's got his pawn on f5. So now obviously the threat is to take and win a pawn, and then you have two pass pawns. So here we see knight to f3. We see knight to f3 followed by e5, which is the whole idea of this. So essentially break through here so then we can push the f pawn. Or potentially even push the e4 pawn if we have chance. Now Reti does comment that knight to d3 wouldn't necessarily help prevent the pawn break, because here black could just play bishop to e4, and black may not have any issue with necessarily giving up the bishop for the knight, because black will have two very strong pass pawns. And notice that this bishop is also eyeing straight along to here to the h2 pawn as well. So we have knight to f3, e5, f takes e5, bishop takes e5, and now bishop to d3. Now this move is deliberate, so Jonna deliberately gives up this h2 pawn. Obviously the knight's defending the pawn currently, but he's willing to sacrifice the pawn, which is what happens in the game. Bishop takes h2. And the reason is he's hoping that although black has two passed pawns, white still has the potential for a pawn side, for a queenside majority. And because of the opposite colour bishops, white is hoping that they will be able to hold this position and potentially get a draw. Because opposite colour bishops are endgames tend to be drawish. However, Bogoljubov had no issue going into this endgame because he knew it was still won. We see bishop to e2, king to e5, king to e3, bishop f4 check, king to f3. So white's bishop is preventing the h pawn from advancing, and black's king is hoping to try and prevent any king maneuvering into here. But we after bishop c1. Oh, sorry. I'm mistaken. King d3 wasn't played in the game. It's a variation I've got. In the game was actually king to f3. If white played king to d3, then something like bishop c1 could come, attacking the a3 pawn. Because after a4, king f4, now black's king is in time to just escort these pawns up. So instead of king d3, we had king to f3. But again, bishop to c1 is played, a4, and now king to d4, bishop to d1, hoping to try and defend this pawn, of king to d3, bishop e2 check, king to c2, and now the b3 pawn simply can't be saved. Obviously, check would just lose the bishop. This bishop's defending this pawn and also stopping the black king from getting anywhere nearby. And these pawns are about to fall. Black's going to get the b3 pawn and is almost certainly going to get one of the other pawns as well. And because of this, white simply resigned. And so that is game number 55, the last game of Bogoljubov, and quite a nice ending where Bogoljubov is able to convert the position into an opposite colour bishop ending, which he knew was winning. So quite a nice game, a rare win in one of these endings. Now, if you like this video, please do like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time where we will look at the Reti opening. Thank you for watching.